Hello and welcome back to my channel and to my 3 monthly roundup of the best films I've been watching recently. Now, tomorrow I turn 53 years of age, yes, half a century on this planet. And you get to a certain age and you've watched a lot of movies, you've read a lot of film criticism, and you think you know your way around film. You think you know the landmarks, the great movies of film history. You've seen it all. You've mapped it out in your head. You know the trajectory of how film develops and who are the major directors and what are the major films. And you think, I've seen it all really. I'll still see some good new movies from this point onwards. But the basics, the fundamentals, I know. But just before Christmas, I got a bit of a shock. I watched this. L'Amour Fou by Jacques Rivette, and suddenly I got this slap across the face that I didn't know it all, and there was a major missing link of cinema that I'd missed. Now, I've been a great admirer of Jacques Rivette for a long time. I love Out One, Céline and Julie Go Boating, La Belle Noiseuse. I recognise him as a major figure of the Nouvelle Vague. And I saw Out One as his great masterpiece. I started watching L'Amour Fou many years ago. Very bad print, very sort of scratchy black and white print, and I got a bit bored, and I sort of put it aside in my head and thought, well, this is an early attempt to make something like Out One. But this brilliant Blu-ray, the greatest Blu-ray release of last year from Radiance Films, showed me what a terrible mistake I'd made. This is a beautifully remastered print, the cinematography is gorgeous, and the film just comes to life. And what I'd realised is, this isn't just a huge landmark in Jacques Rivette's filmmaking, where he really discovers himself as a filmmaker after the original Nouvelle Vague period. No. This is a major film in European art house cinema, and it's a major film in cinema full stop. It's like, Stromboli by Rossellini is the first calling card of modern cinema after the war. And then you get to Antonioni's L'Avventura. Some people think Godard's Breathless, but I dispute that. This is the next film. This is the next quantum leap forward. First of all, it's the realisation of a completely new aesthetic in cinema. What Rivette does here is he sets up in this theatre. This guy he's a director of a theatre troupe, and they're rehearsing Andromache, a classical Racine play. And much of the film is taken up with these rehearsals. A man trying to take control of an environment, of actors and space. But right at the start of the film, he dismisses his own partner, his own wife, from the cast. And slowly, in their little apartment, their world starts to fall apart. So the film is contrasting the space of this rehearsal studio where he's trying to control the world. And then he goes back to his apartment and he's trying to stop his relationship from deteriorating. And this is represented by the two of them increasingly enclose themselves in this apartment. They sort of take themselves away from the world. And they start tearing this apartment to pieces, metaphorically tearing their own relationship to pieces. So you've got control versus loss of control. And not only is this an incredibly new film, there's nothing like it beforehand, but also, if you look back at Rossellini's Stromboli and Michelangelo Antonioni's L'Avventura, part of the reason that they were major stepping stones in modern art house cinema was their representation of the modern woman and their representation of the modern couple. How two people got together. And that's where this film is so important. The representation of the relationship between the director and his wife is staggeringly modern. There's just nothing like it up to this point. It was supposedly based on the sort of rather damaging relationship between Jean-Luc Godard and Anna Karina, actually. But it's an extraordinarily intimate, devastating portrait of the tensions that come between a couple and how they tear themselves apart. There's nothing like this. It's such a quantum leap forward from the way couples were represented, for example, in the 1960s. And that's why I've realised that, far from being just another Rivette film, this is actually one of the major European films of all time. And it's completely reconstructed the way I think about the history of cinema. If you've not seen it, please get hold of this Blu-ray. It's absolutely incredible. It is a major masterwork of cinema. So I thought, wow, here I am, 53 years of age, and I'm discovering a whole new way of looking at film. And then a month later, right, it happened again. And I found another film that I should have seen was a major stepping stone. Now, to be fair, I'd actually seen this film before, but I saw it right at the beginning of my film going, and I didn't really appreciate it at the time. Watching it this time round, all these years later, it was like seeing a completely new film, right? It's called Still Life. Now, there are many films with that title. This is an Iranian film from the early 70s by a director called Sohrab Saeed Saleh. Now, that name may not be very familiar to you, even though you might know some Iranian cinema. He was an Iranian filmmaker back in the early 1970s, and many people at the time considered him to be the person who kick-started the whole sort of Iranian cinema movement. He was one of the people credited with that, though in the West we barely know him. Perhaps because, as the 70s went on, he moved to Germany into exile and started making films there, and then his career seemed to peter out. Now, why is this film so significant? The film is about this old guy who works as a railway signalman. He sleeps all day in this little stone hut. Every so often he gets up and he does the signals and he waves the train through, and then he potters back to his signal hut and has a sleep. Then he goes back home where his poor wife has to make the tea and the dinner and is making carpets to give them a secondary income. And they just sit there, they don't do anything, they don't speak to anybody, they don't seem to have any recreation, and it just goes on and on and on. Yes, my friends, we are in the realm of what was called in the 90s slow cinema. I hate that expression. But basically, the cinema of contemplation, that sort of the classic moan of people, oh, it's one of those films where nothing happens. In this film, really, zero happens, right? And it's just a contemplation of people's everyday lives. Saleh really, it takes everything out of everyday life. It's almost like a still life portrait, a painting. And it's extremely beautiful and moving. And it makes these two lonely people, these two lonely old people at this railway crossing, sort of iconic. They become images of a sort of timeless, rustic way of life. At the end of the film, we see the old man go to the city because he's been sacked. He's been retired by the state without them giving him any warning, and he doesn't know what to do. It's his whole life. And we see suddenly the world of the city comes in, and it seems very superficial and busy, and people are not really caring about each other. So we've spent this whole movie looking at this old man, seeing how pathetic he is, how conservative he is, how locked in his ways he is, this kind of dead world. But then right at the end we get this shock that it's contrasted with the busy world, the urban world, the modern world. And we see that there's a loss, there's a lack, there's a disconnect. It's a very beautiful kind of way of using cinema as a sort of single image portrait, like a painting of an idea. And what I realised was this anticipated the slow cinema of the 90s by about 20 years. I loved the slow cinema of the 90s and the early 2000s. I was a big devotee of it. I know a lot of people hate it. But I loved it. And I thought it started in the 90s. And here was this guy. Everything that I liked about slow cinema was in place in his films when I was born in 1972. Kick-starting the whole Iranian cinema of Kiarostami and Makhmalbaf and people like that I love. So here was this landmark that I hadn't really appreciated, and suddenly there it is right in front of my face. And then it happened again. Now, many moons ago on this channel, some of you will remember, I did a video picking out my top 10 most underrated film noir. And some of you responded in your comments, and a lot of you advised me to watch this film called The Chase. Now, this isn't the 1960s film directed by Arthur Penn with Marlon Brando. This is an earlier film from the 1940s. And on paper, it seems like a pretty regular film noir. So there's this guy, and he's on Skid Row. He's looking for a job, right? He finds a wallet in the street. He takes it to this house, and the wallet just happens to belong to the Mr. Big of the local hood, you know. And Mr. Big takes pity on him and gives him a job as his chauffeur, right? And then the chauffeur meets the lady of the house, who clearly wants to get away from this big hood, and they develop a sort of friendship. So far, so film noir. You've seen this a million times, right? And then it all goes a bit strange. And this is where the chase becomes... I've since found out that this movie is like a cult within a cult. So even among the cult of film noir fans, this film has a very special reputation. Some people love it and some people hate it. I completely fell head over heels in love with it. Because what happens once this chauffeur gets to know the lady of the house is very, very strange indeed. Now, I don't want to spoil it. This is a film that's best experienced without spoilers. But suffice to say that often film noir feels like a bit of a nightmare in which a bloke is trapped. This one feels more like that than any other film I've seen. And partly that's to do with the fact that, let's just say we have unreliable narrator syndrome. This is a very odd film. And its director, Arthur Ripley, uses all sorts of interesting techniques, spatial techniques and camera techniques, and particularly the use of music, to evoke not so much to get the plot moving, but to evoke what's happening up here in the protagonist's mind. It's very brilliantly done. And one way that I would suggest, if you go and watch the movie, look out for the piano. Now, there's a very beautiful piano in the main house. I'm not talking about that piano. I'm talking about another piano. You'll know what I mean. There's a piano in a room, and if you start thinking to yourself, what on earth is a piano doing in that room? Then you're starting to understand how this film works. Then you're starting to understand its genius. It will play a narrative trick on you that many people watching this will think, oh, that's too far-fetched, I'm not accepting that. Okay, fine, you won't enjoy the movie. But if you're prepared to go with the narrative trick, this is an ingenious, really clever and really brilliant film noir, and a major work in the genre. I want to say two other things about it. It's a very interesting film. You remember what we were saying about the Jacques Rivette film and Control? The Chase is also about control. It's about one man's control being controlled by another man. So this big hood controlling the chauffeur. And this is literalized. There's a literal sort of metaphor for this in the movie. So right at the beginning, the chauffeur gets his first job and he's driving the big bad man. He's in the back and he's driving him along. And the big bad man, he flips something over in front of him with his foot. And he's got his own controls. And he can accelerate or decelerate the car from the back seat. So the guy's driving along, but the guy behind him is controlling the acceleration. It's a wonderful literal metaphor of what the movie is about. The idea of being controlled by another person, that you're directing your destiny, but someone else is directing the speed and the nature of it. The whole movie is about that. And what we find is that not only is this guy, there's external forces, but there are also internal forces. His own conscience, his own memory is something he can't control. One final word about this film, because it really interested me. Steve Cochran. Now, I don't know if that name means anything to you. I became interested in this actor when I saw the Antonioni film Il Grido. Now, this was the film that he made before L'Avventura. It often gets ignored, but I think it's one of the great films of the 1950s, actually. It's a very underrated film. Now, in those days, Italian films often hired international stars, usually American or British stars, and they overdubbed them. They put them in main roles and they overdubbed them in order to get international audiences watching the movies. And Il Grido stars Steve Cochran, an actor, when I saw the film, I'd never heard of him. Was he a big American star? I didn't know anything about him. And I loved this anecdote that Antonioni told about Steve Cochran. He was working with him on Il Grido. And Steve Cochran was a kind of method actor, and he kept saying, what's my motivation? And Antonioni was just saying, just stand over there, and I'll film you with the light behind you, and then just move over there. And he said, but why am I doing that? And Antonioni said, this was intolerable. And that's all I knew about Steve Cochran. But in this movie, Steve Cochran plays the big bad. He's the hood, right? And he gives a really interesting performance. I'd never seen him in an American movie before, and he's really good. He plays this really creepy, quiet, passively aggressive mobster with very unusual lines. All of his sort of reactions are quite strange. I don't know whether I thought it was a good performance, but it was a fascinating performance. So it's kind of interesting to see Steve Cochran in the flesh. But then, it happened again. And I saw another major film, another major turning point in film history that I hadn't watched before. Now that film is That Day at the Beach. This was the first film, and what a debut. One of the great film debuts in world cinema. The first film by the Taiwanese director Edward Yang. Now, in the 1980s and 1990s, Taiwanese cinema it changed from being a very commercial cinema to being a more art house independent cinema. And it became one of the key movements in world cinema along with Iranian cinema. And Edward Yang and Hu Chao-chen were its two first big proponents. Now, I've seen all of Edward Yang's films, except for this one. For some reason, I'd missed it. And I didn't realise just how important it is. First of all, how brilliant it is. How incredibly ambitious it is for a first film. It's about 3 hours long. And it's an incredibly ambitious film. It's, often people say, movies have a novelistic texture, but they're nothing like novels. Actually, Yang's best films are. They have the complexity and the nuance and the detail of a novel. This film is about a young woman. She's become abroad. She's moved abroad and she's become an internationally acclaimed pianist. And after 13 years away, she returns to Taiwan. And rather reluctantly, she meets up with a friend of hers. This friend was the sister of the man she was due to marry. But he jilted her. And so she went off on her travels and became a famous pianist. And now she's coming back. And this girl who she meets up with, she's had her own journey. And she tells the lady in flashback what's happened to her, her story. And so her story becomes a personal flashback, but also a flashback of the last 13 years of Taiwanese history. And she talks about how she got married to this young man. They were in love with each other, but then he got involved in business. He had to make a living, and the business slowly took him over, both personally and professionally. And it's pulled them apart. And the whole movie is about how Taiwanese society, and a capitalist society, seems destined to pull a husband and wife apart. That seems to be what the film is about. But it's an incredibly ambitious and bold film. It wants to talk about Taiwan, it wants to talk about society, it wants to talk about men and women, it wants to talk about happiness. What does happiness mean? And I was stunned by it, and I realised these Taiwanese films by Hu Chao-chen and Edward Yang that I've admired all these years, this is where they came from. This was the starting point. In Taiwan, it was seen as the great sort of movement forward, and I'd never watched it before. I was actually led to watching it by, I watched again The Terrorizers, which is his third film. Yang only made 7 films. The Terrorizers is probably his least watched film, but I really love it. It's a very strange film. It's also in Taipei, and it starts off like a sort of Altman-esque vision of there's a police siege of some kind of prostitute crack den, very brilliantly edited and filmed, and it's about how these disparate characters get involved in this, and it moves between their different stories. So it's kind of like an Altman shortcut style movie, but then it changes, right? And so it suddenly becomes more melodramatic, and it starts to concentrate on one character in particular, following his sort of journey into madness and his whole life falling apart. And then it changes again, and you start to see that it's a film about art and telling stories. And I fell in love with the film all over again. I hadn't seen it for many years. It's one of Yang's most ignored movies. But it led me to think I should watch That Day at the Beach. And That Day at the Beach is a 5-star, 24-carat masterpiece, and one of the greatest movies I've ever seen. So 4 films in a row have, over the past 2 months, totally reconstructed my idea of the history of cinema. That's what happens when you get to 53. Okay, let's move on to some more modern films now. Now, I did my top 10 last year, as usual, at the start of December, but then I saw a movie just before Christmas that I would definitely have added to that top 10 if I'd seen it. And that is About Dry Grasses by Nuri Bilge Ceylan, the Turkish director. Now, I first fell in love with this director back in the 2000s with films like Uzak and Climates. I kind of went off him a bit in recent years, but this is Ceylan back to full strength and one of the best films I've seen in recent years. It's fantastic. What Ceylan is good at, first of all, he's a visually beautiful director. All his films look incredible. And this one is set out in this snowy village, out in the sort of hilly wastes of Turkey. So it's very stunning visually. But he's also, I think, one of the best directors in the last 20 years for sort of keeping us abreast of the modern European intellectual and what's going through their minds. Now, at the centre of this film is a rather unlikable guy, but he's our everyman character. And he's this intelligent graduate guy, sort of in his early 30s. And he's been sent to teach at this school. It's of a sort of ethnic community that I don't really understand the sort of the particular history of it. But he's been sent there out in the wilds to teach. And he doesn't really want to be there. He wants to be back in Istanbul or somewhere exciting, you know. So he's got a bit of a chip on his shoulder. Anyway, he's taken a liking to one of the pupils and he treats her a bit. And then one day, she accuses him and his colleague of making improper advances. You know, that sort of thing. So it's a kind of bang-up-to-date film dealing with very contemporary issues. And it's what happens with the fallout of that. It's a much more complex movie than that. It's exploring a lot of things to do with modern Turkey, to do with the modern intellectual, and so on and so forth. But it's brilliantly written. And it's a very brave film that at times it just has people talking in a room. It knows when to stop trying to push you cinematically and just hold back and just watch people talking and the tensions of that. And I thought it was his best film in years, at least since like Winter Light, his Palme d'Or winner in about 2015. It's a really fantastic movie. Now, if you follow this channel, you know who I'm going to talk about next, so I'll keep it very brief, because I know you're sick and tired of me talking about this director, but I've got to mention my latest Hong Sang-soo discovery. I just have to. I've finally caught up with Hong Sang-soo, except that he's only going to make another bloody movie, which I've got to see. But I finally caught up with him last month, and I saw his most recent film, By the Stream. Absolute masterpiece. Just such a simple film, and eons ahead of everybody else working. Again, one of the reasons why it's good is it puts his muse, Kim Min-hee, back in the spotlight. And she's a teacher at this college. And one of the other teachers has had an affair with some of the students, so he's been banished. And he was putting together a play that the students were going to put on. So she calls in her uncle, who is a famous director, to help her get this play across the road, and also to try and set him up with her friend, this teacher who fancies him. So it seems like a very gentle little movie, right? But the undercurrents in it. And this is a rare film where Hong touches on politics, because we find out that this famous director has been cancelled because of his political views. And that's a sort of undercurrent that ripples throughout the film. I think this film is so beautiful. It's so simple. It's so true. The final freeze frame stuck in my heart for days. I love Hong Sang-soo, but I'll shut up about him now, because those of you who don't like him are probably bored of hearing about it. The next film I wanted to talk about was Godland. Now, this came out of the blue. Director I'd never heard of before, and I just thought, I'll try it. What an interesting film. It's set in the 1800s, and it's about this Danish priest is sent by his church to help set up a new church and community in Iceland. Apparently, back in those days, the history of Denmark and Iceland was quite odd. Denmark sort of positioned itself as having influence over Iceland, political influence, which the Icelanders didn't really like. So anyway, this young priest, he gets to Iceland. Now, this movie, for those of you who just like, landscape porn, beautiful shots of the landscape, oh my God, you've got to watch this film. It's so beautiful. It makes you just want to go and buy a trip to Iceland straight away. I've been to Iceland. Unfortunately, I went at the wrong time. You either have to go at high summer, when everything is accessible, or you have to go at high winter, because then you can get to see all the glaciers and all the incredible ice formations and everything. I went sort of in September time, which is a bit of a crappy time to go, really. It mostly just looks a bit bleak and a bit dark and like a lunar landscape, I went to the Blue Lagoon and, sort of trundled around Reykjavik, and that was it, really. Not the right time to go. But Iceland, if you go at the right time, and this is all filmed in high summer, is an incredibly beautiful country. It's amazingly unspoiled. And this film really captures it. So anyway, this priest turns up, and he meets this guide, this Icelandic guide, who doesn't like him very much. He doesn't like these Danes coming over. And so the first part of the movie, it's like a Western. It's like a settler Western. These guys in this horse train going across country, trying to get to this settlement. And the sort of tension that develops between this Danish priest and his guide. The second part of the movie changes when we get to the community. I don't want to talk about that too much because it will spoil it. But what I liked about this film was, though I thought I always felt, oh, it's going to become predictable, it never becomes predictable. And the relationships between the characters subtly change and surprise you. It's a film that keeps stinging you, right? And the other thing I liked about this film was its ambition. So at one point, right, there's this extraordinary shot where you see the horse train disappearing into the distance, but the camera stays behind, and it slowly pans across this beautiful marsh landscape in the twilight. It just moves across it, and then it moves down towards the grass itself, and you can hear the sort of little blips and pucks of the water in the grass and the little worms amongst the soundscape is incredible, right? You can almost hear the earth after rainfall, and it moves and it moves and it moves and it moves, and finally it ends on a close-up. The priest has been left behind because he's ill, and there he is down amongst the grasses with little pops and clicks of the water in the blades. It's an absolute tour de force. It's a coup de cinema. It's worth watching just for that sequence alone. But the movie is full of that kind of bravura filmmaking, sometimes a bit show-offy. But that's okay, I'll allow it, because overall the movie is fantastic. It's a brilliant period film, a brilliant landscape film, and it's quite an interesting little disquisition on religion and morality. Now let's talk about After Yang. Now, the poster for this movie gave me a bit of a chuckle, really, because it's the kind of poster that would give Nigel Farage or any anti-wokester a heart attack. I mean, just look at this poster. It's almost designed to upset people who vote Reform UK, isn't it? But, well, the film is quite woke, I have to be honest. And it stars Colin Farrell. What a strange phenomenon Colin Farrell is. And this is yet another of these movies that's kind of rehabilitated Colin Farrell into being a good actor. How did that happen? I know, it's incredible. Anyway, so Colin Farrell is the husband. He has a black wife and he has an East Asian child. So you can imagine Nigel Farage at this point going, oh. But anyway, so to make it even more woke, right, they've bought this kind of android. And this android is there to help the East Asian child, I suppose he's been adopted, with his cultural background, right? But now this android its circuitry is going, it's dying. So hence it's called Yang, and then the film is After Yang. What happens to this family once this android goes and they realise how much they've been reliant on it? So what you've got here is, it's kind of like Ex Machina, Alex Garland, and it's filmed in a very similar kind of house as well. And part of what I like about this film is its visual beauty. But what happens is Colin Farrell, he's trying to repair this android, and he gets inside its memory circuits and he starts to see the way it thinks. And he realises that it had a conscience, it had a memory, and it was actually falling in love, right? So it's about humans and machines, human intelligence, artificial intelligence. It's that kind of Blade Runner, Ex Machina territory. But this is a much quieter, calmer film. It's a sort of emo sci-fi, very low budget. I like the way the science fiction elements in it are handled, actually. I think they're very tastefully handled on a low budget. But what I liked about this movie was, I liked its beauty, both its visual beauty and its sort of... It's an American film that is not based around conflict, but it's based around understanding. And I really like that and I value it. It was made by a guy called Kogo Nada. Now, Kogo Nada is he's Korean American, and he used to be a film blogger and writer. And he's turned to filmmaking, and his debut film was a film called Columbus, which is a very, very lovely film, and its visual style is taken from the architecture around Columbus, Ohio. So if you've never seen that, check it out. It's a very lovely film. I like this film. I thought it was a good follow-up. It's a very still, gentle film, a very nice film. If you want a bit more oomph, a bit more conflict, you won't like it. It's a sort of emo film for snowflakes, But I thought it was quite gentle and quite beautiful. I really liked it. Next, The Ninth Heart. Now, About a year and a half ago, I came across a film, a version of Beauty and the Beast that was made in Czechoslovakia in the late 70s. It was made by a director called Juraj Hers. He's best known for his art film The Cremator. And I really loved it. I particularly liked the music score, which was fantastic. Now, almost at the same time, back to back, he made another fantasy film, another fairy tale film called The Ninth Heart. This has got more of a darker storyline. It's about this occult magician who wants to get off with the local baron's daughter, and he sort of gets power over her. And one of the ways he does it is he kills people and he keeps their heart, and from their heart he creates this elixir which gives him immortality. And this young lad, this student who's poor, he decides, he's recruited by the baron to help the princess, and he goes to this strange, undead castle of this occult magician to save her. So it's pure fairy tale, but it's fairy tale a la Brothers Grimm. It's not Disney. It's very dark and strange. And the way it's directed, I think that the direction, the use of vision and sound is incredible. And it's directed in a rather chaotic, rather adult style, rather dark style. There's one point where at the centre of the occult magician's castle is the world of time. And there's this great big pendulum, a la Edgar Allan Poe, swinging, and they all start to age, and they're trapped there for a year, and they're just aging, and everyone else in the real world is starting to forget them. It's quite heavy stuff for a kid. There's this incredible sequence, which I loved, where the daughter turns up, she's taken by boat, rather like that Arnold Böcklin painting, the Isle of the Dead. She's taken on this boat, and she turns up at this occult castle, and he has this ball, the ball of the undead. And it's done in this kind of lurid Baroque style with sort of Middle Eastern caliphate where, sort of costumed people walking around. It's amazingly weird. Nothing is ever explained. Nothing's ever explained in the dialogue. It's all done through sound and image. And the musical score is fantastic. Hertz uses music beautifully. It's great. I mean, I wouldn't advise it for your kids to watch on their own, but as a one-off sort of adult fairy tale, it's absolutely fantastic. Half the time, you're trying to work out what the bloody story is. You're not told. You and the protagonist have to work out what the hell is going on. That's part of the film, but that's part of what I liked about it. You're sort of thrown into a nightmare, and it's got a really special feel. You can find it on rarefilms.com. And finally, a pleasant surprise. I Start Counting. Now, this stars a young Jenny Agutter. Stop it. We're not talking Walkabout here. We're not talking Logan's Run. We're not talking about the shower scene in American Werewolf in London. That was a formative scene for me, that was, when I was a teenager. But Jenny, you were in The Railway Children, and he's an American. Oh, dear, I'm still not over it. But it's not that kind of thing, right? So in this film, this is one of her early films, and she's a teenage girl who's sort of going through the rites of passage and having a sexual awakening. Stop it. Now look, this is a serious film channel. We're not having any of that business. Les Dawson could make jokes about that in the 70s, but not now. Muck, muck, muck. No, she's very good. She's a very young actress starting out. She's surprisingly brilliant, actually, as a juvenile actress. Really good performance. She plays this young girl, and she's growing up in a tower block. She's a sort of working class, daughter of a working class family. And she completely idolises her stepbrother. It's a bit of an odd relationship. But as the film develops, there's a series of murders has taken place in the local area. And she starts to suspect that her brother is the killer. So there's a thriller element. The thriller element is a bit boring, actually. And it kind of, at the end, it comes to the fore and it gets too much plot. And it's, it's kind of boring. But that's not what's interesting about the movie. What's interesting about this movie is it was made in 1968. And it's a movie that's made for a wide audience. It's not an art house film. It's a mainstream drama. And it's intelligent, it's well written, it's well acted, it's really likeable. It's also set in a recognisably modern Britain, right? It's not set in a fake Britain or a sentimentalised Britain, but just in a modern Britain. And it takes account of the way Britain is changing. And that's actually what the movie is about. So as this girl is moving from childhood through adolescence into adulthood, the country also seems to be going through the same process. So we see the old houses. This family used to live in a farmhouse out in the country. Now that farmhouse has been knocked down and they've been moved into a new estate. And we see all around the world changing. And so what you've got is proof that in British cinema you could have a mainstream film made for everybody that was intelligent, likeable, well made and well acted. And you think, why was this path not taken? Why has it been so difficult to do this ever since? Why do we assume in this country that we either have crappy romantic comedies with Hugh Grant or, gangster dramas, or we get really hardcore art house? And there's nothing in between. And you go back to this 1968 film, it was unsuccessful at the time. No one went to see it, sadly. It's been in some vault, and the BFI have recently revived it and put it on Blu-ray, and you watch it and you think, Jesus, it was possible. Britain could have its own cinema that was intelligent and it was of us, the people watching it. Why wasn't this done more often? It's kind of sad, it's a kind of melancholy aspect to it, but it's also a really lovely little film. It's no masterpiece, it's not a giant work of cinema, but it's just kind of refreshing and really likeable. And I really advise you to, what's that? Now get that off the screen. We're not talking about Jenny again. Stop that now. Right. But it's just a really likeable and enjoyable film, and I think that anyone could watch it and enjoy it. So those are the 10 films I've enjoyed most discovering over the last 3 months. Let me know what you think of them below, and if there's any films that you want me to check out and think I'd like. Thanks very much.